Bonjour à toutes et tous. Bienvenue au Musée du quai Branly Jacques Chirac. Je suis Anne-Solène Roland, la directrice du patrimoine et des collections du Musée du quai Branly. Et au nom du président de l'établissement,
Emmanuel Casarero, the president of the museum, I'm thrilled to wish you a very warm welcome to the Théâtre Claude Lévi-Strauss here in person and online for a very packed day. A packed and important day. Dear MP Raphael Gérard, thank you for being here. We're honored to have you, as is the rest of the community. Dear colleagues from Econ CC and from the FFCR, thank you for being here and for having contributed to organizing this symposium. The museum is honored to be hosting this event. Indeed, hosting a full-day event on the very definition of the profession of conservator-restorers holds great meaning for us. For many of you, and the French among you are well aware of this, the Musée du quai Branly is a national museum under the Culture Ministry and the Ministry for Education, and is one of the few French museums to have had a team of conservator-restorers. And so it holds particular relevance for us to host, to participate, and actively contribute to today's event. I'd also like to thank the entire team under the leadership of Éléonore Kissel. I see that nearly the entire team is here with us today, our team of conservator-restorers. Of course, they were very much a part of the organization of today's event. Now, ever since this museum was opened in 2006,
des équipes scientifiques, c'est une grande chance. Ce n'est pas à vous que je vais l'apprendre.
We have known how fortunate we are to have a team of conservator-restorers.
À notre quotidien, à mon quotidien en particulier en tant que responsable des collections du musée.
Really makes a big difference to our work, in particular my work as director of collections. It has a big impact on the way that our collections are appreciated, and it brings an additional degree of understanding of the objects we hold in our collections. So it helps us achieve standards of excellence. Additionally,
dans cet établissement, c'est aussi
what this team of conservator-restorers does as well is participate in research projects. I do wish to emphasize that our museum also engages in research, in scientific analysis, and our conservator-restorers are very much a part of that work. Now, on a more personal note, if I may, today's event is particularly significant to me because, like many of you, I am amongst the curators in France who have closely worked with conservator-restorers throughout their careers. And ever since I started working as a curator, I have always been aware of how fortunate I am. Additionally, I myself led this conservation restoration team here at the museum 15 years ago. As such, I contributed to building this team and setting out its ways of working and so on. And so that is also why I am happy to be present here today. Some of you may know as well that I also worked at the Louvre, where I worked with the preventive conservation team. And just a quick aside, this very term, conservator-restorers at the Louvre, was actually highly debated by curators. So words are important, terminology is important. And I would add that I'm thrilled to have Pascal Lévaux and Judith Cagan here today, my former colleagues. And in my role with the Musée de France, I also worked very closely with the CDUAMF. And I also would like to acknowledge Clémentine Bollard, who is currently the president of the FFCR, who will be speaking later today. And we were in close contact during the pandemic. In my role at the Musée de France, it was important to me to continue that kind of collaboration. Now, I don't want to be much longer, but I want to emphasize how important this is to me and how timely this event is, how pleased I am to be hosting here at the Quai Branly this event on the profession and its practices. I thank you very much for being here, and I wish you rich and fruitful exchanges, and I hope many more to come.
Et je cède donc la parole à Clémentine Bollard.
And I now give the floor to Clémentine Bollard for the FFCR and our colleagues from ICOM-CC, the president of ICOM-CC, who will be introducing today's event.
Merci Anne-Solène.
Thank you, Anne-Solène.
Je voudrais commencer par
I'd like to begin
remercier au nom
by thanking in the name of the president of the French Federation of Conservation and Restoration Professionals, Aude Radrozevic, and on behalf of the entire organizing committee, the Quai Branly Museum, which is hosting this event today for its logistical and financial support.
Et je dois dire, chère Anne-Solène, que
And Solène, I must say that the French Federation of Conservation and Restoration Professionals has always been able to count on your support, on your precious support, and for that I thank you. For those of you who do not know the FFCR, perhaps those of you following online,
voilà, dépasse largement les frontières de l'Hexagone.
Well, of course, this of course the issue today goes far beyond France, and so you may not be familiar with this federation. The French Federation brings together conservator-restorers who have a master's degrey in the field, and of course the relevant professional experience. Now, just to give you a bit of context, I just wanted to say a few words about the profession in France today. And in order to do that, I'd like to discuss a study that was published by Léonie Hainaut and Gaspard Selatko,
établi que actuellement en France,
And they showed that currently in France, 80% of conservator-restorers are women. We have 1,800 master's holders and 1,300 are currently in the profession, and only 1/4 work in museums, universities, or research laboratories. Therefore, that means that 3/4 of us are in different organizations. Now, the profession is regulated in the sense that to work on museum collections, you need to demonstrate that you have the relevant diploma or experience, or either a master's degree or work experience in the public sector, or you need to have been accredited by the Musée de France, where Anne Solène previously worked. All that to say that if you look at other fields such as archaeology, historical monuments, libraries, archives, well, there's no specific prerequisite in order to work as a conservator-restorer. And that is why it is so important to talk about the definition of conservator-restorers in France. You will notice on the FFCR logo that we have a hyphen between the C of conservator and the R for restorer. The French professional community has adopted the term of conservator-restorer, which was enshrined in the 1984 definition. It is used to refer to professionals who previously had different names, but the skills that the profession entailed weren't always very clear. So, the 1984 definition will be discussed today along with other documents, and this definition gave a clear and consistent terminology in order to facilitate communication amongst members and ICOM members, the entirety of the international professional community, and more generally, the general public. So that was the 2010 ICOM resolution on conservation, restoration of tangible cultural heritage. Now, of course, definitions are at the very heart of this disciplinary field and the general ecosystem. And so it was important to our federation to commemorate the anniversary of the adoption of this definition by the ICOM-CC. Kate and Stephanie are here with us today. The idea being that we would organize an event in order to take stock of the profession 40 years after the adoption of this text and to think about future prospects. It seemed obvious to us that these issues shouldn't be limited to France nor Europe, but that we should engage the professional community as a whole, and that is why we asked ICOM-CC to work with us on this event, because it is that organization that published the text after all, and we're thrilled that they were able to be a part of this. We therefore built this program together, And just to give you a sense of what we're going to do today, we're going to go back in time and talk about the genesis of this definition. Then we will reflect on French legislation, how law is created, and how that regulation might evolve. And we're going to talk about a bill about legally recognizing the title. And then we'll have 3 round tables on skills. The second one will be about the theory and practice of conservation restoration. And the third will be about defining or redefining. Now, I don't want to be much longer. I will now give the floor to Kate Seymour. But unfortunately, Kate has lost her voice, but Stephanie, who's the vice president of the ICOM-CC Bureau, will be speaking on her behalf, on Kate's behalf. Thank you to both of them for being here with us and for having worked on this event with us. It was a real pleasure to have done this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Clementine. As you can all hear, I've kind of lost my voice today. So I wanted to be here to welcome everybody and to give some words of reflection on our organization. So I'm going to hand over to Stephanie de Roma, our Vice Chair of ICOM-CC, who's going to read the speech to you. But thank you all for being here, and thank you, FFCR, for the wonderful collaboration. We're really excited about today.
Bonjour. I will be Kate Seymour's voice for this introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests, welcome to the conference What's in the Name? The Conservator-Restorer, a Definition. As we gather here today, we embark on a journey of exploration, reflection, and collaboration at the forefront of cultural heritage conservation. Established in 1967, the International Council for Museums Committee for Conservation, ICOM-CC, stands as a beacon in our shared mission to safeguard the world's cultural heritage. With 21 working groups comprising of conservators, curators, artists, scientists, and heritage professionals, ICOM-CC provides a vital network facilitating the exchange of knowledge, practices, and ethical considerations essential to our collective endeavor. Our vision is clear: to elevate the conservation profession within the museum sector by fostering access to the latest practices, materials, and ethical guidelines. Through specialist events organized by our working groups and triennial conferences, we aim to strengthen the global museum conservation community and propel it into the future. Guided by our mission, we advocate for the conservation of cultural heritage, fostering interdisciplinary collaboration, and providing a framework for professional growth. The dissemination of knowledge through publications, reports, and newsletters ensures that our efforts resonate far beyond the confines of this conference hall. In this pursuit, we have enjoyed fruitful collaboration with the Fédération Française de Conservateurs-Restaurateurs, whose expertise and insights have enriched our understanding and practice in the field and in developing the program for this event. Yet, as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the ICOM-CC 1984 definition of a profession, we confront lingering questions regarding its application and relevance, particularly in diverse linguistic and cultural contexts, and considering how the field has evolved over the past 40 years. The ambiguity surrounding the definition of the conservator-restorer in France exemplifies the challenges we face in harmonizing terminology and understanding across borders. This conference serves as a platform for critical reflection and dialogue. We will revisit the genesis of the 1984 definition, examining its evolution and impact on our profession. Moreover, we will explore avenues for refining and expanding this definition to accommodate emerging practices, theories, and cultural perspectives. However, we do not intend to issue a new definition, but rather to foster dialogue globally surrounding our working practices and competencies. From the protection of professional titles to the imperative of competency-based training, from evolving conservation practices to the need for tailored definitions, our agenda is rich with topics essential to shaping the future of our field. Together, we strive to underscore the intrinsic value of cultural heritage and fortify our sector's resilience in the face of global challenges. By fostering collaboration, innovation, and inclusivity, we envision a future where the conservation field thrives, ensuring the enduring legacy of our cultural heritage. Thank you for your dedication to this noble cause and for attending this event, and I wish you all fruitful deliberations and insights throughout today. Let us embark on this journey together, united in our commitment to conserving our shared heritage for generations to come.
Bonjour.
Good morning.
Nous allons commencer avec la
We're going to
première
start
table ronde
this
qui porte sur l'héritage de la
conference
définition
with the first
1984.
roundtable session
Nous
on the
avons
1984 definition.
l'immense chance
We have the
de pouvoir
immense
compter sur
privilege
un historique
of
qui va nous
relying
être
on
présenté de
a
cette
presentation
profession de
that will be given to
conservateur-restaurateur
us
par
on
Pierre
the
Lévaux,
profession of
chercheur associé au Centre Branly de
Conservateur-Restaurer
l'Université d'Aix-Marseille.
by
Et
a specialist from
avoir,
Aix-Marseille.
Aussi un historique, mais un historique personnel.
Pierre Levaux,
qui nous sera
and we will
présenté
also
par
have a
Janet
more
Bridgeland,
personal presentation
CC,
given by
et
Janet
Gaël de
Bridgeland
Guichelan
from
pour
ICOM-CC and Gaël de Guichelan
Gaël
from
et Janet
ICROM.
font partie des personnes
Both
qui
Gail
ont
and Janet
travaillé
have
sur ce qui est
worked
devenu
personally on
la
what
définition
has
de
become
Copenhague, cette fameuse
the
définition
Copenhagen
de
definition,
1984.
the famous 1984
Je les
definition.
accueille, je les laisse s'installer, je leur montre comment se servir de la télécommande et on pourra
Just for the,
partir.
taking the time for them to show how the remote works, and we'll be kicking off.
D'accord.
Le gros bouton vert, c'est pour avancer. Le petit bouton rouge, c'est pour reculer s'il faut. Et ça, c'est un pointeur laser.
D'accord.
Gros bouton.
J'avais imprimé les corrections, mais peu importe.
Non,
Si
peu
je te
importe. Tu fais absolument
Très bien. Très bien, allons-y. Je remercie évidemment
Good.
CC et la FFCR.
I would like to thank FFCO and ICOM-CC for inviting me to this
Mon intervention sera
Congress.
courte, puisque je vais
I
simplement
will be speaking
rappeler
briefly because
Dans les
I
sept-
simply want
sept
to
minutes qui me
recall
sont
in the
imparties
7 minutes that
que la
I have
réforme du métier de restaurateur n'a pas commencé en 1978.
this
ni en
reform has not started in
1984,
1978
mais dans
or
l'entre-deux-guerres, il y a
1984,
plus d'un
but
siècle,
in
et
the
qu'elle se poursuit
interwar
encore
period,
aujourd'hui.
more than a century ago,
Alors,
and is still
j'expliquerai pourquoi
going
elle
on
commence
today.
à cette époque en
I would like
proposant
to
quelques
explain
dates.
why
Et
this
je
is the
suivrai
case
ensuite
with
le
a
fil de
few
l'histoire
important
qui
dates.
conduit
Then I
jusqu'au
will
groupe
be
de travail
going
confié
through history
à
to
Lévi-Strauss en 1978.
the Eisbein work group.
Ma contribution
My colleague will be
s'appuiera
talking
sur
about
des
it
faits,
later on.
s'appuiera sur des faits
I will
et
be
formulera
relying
quelques
on
propositions
facts and
soumises à discussion.
talking about a few
Alors,
proposals
commençons donc par les
for
faits pour
discussion.
répondre à la question de savoir quand commença
First,
l'histoire de la
let's start with the
profession
facts
de
to
conservateur
answer the
restaurateur.
question of when
On peut,
this
à mon avis,
story
la faire commencer
begins.
en 1921, lorsque le
I think
11e congrès international
1921 would be a relevant
d'histoire de l'art
date,
réuni à Paris,
as
demandant
the
demanda aux
11th
anciens
Congress,
restaurateurs de changer leur
the
pratique.
International Congress on the
Mais
Art
elle
History
pourrait aussi
in
bien
Paris,
commencer en
asked
1929, lorsque Daniel
former
Bovy
restorers to
demanda
change their
à la
practice,
Commission
but it could also begin in
internationale
1929
l'ancêtre
when
de l'UNESCO
Daniel
à l'époque
Bovy
de la SDN,
asked the
d'ouvrir
International
des
Commission
écoles
of
pour
the
en former de nouveaux.
Intellectual cooperation, the ancestor of UNESCO, to open up schools to train new ones, or in 1932, as a group of Austrian curators made an official demand to the International Office of Museums, the ancestor of ICOM, to open an investigation on the training of conservators. But 1938 is also important, as this office published the Manual of Conservation for Paintings and Sculptures at the Rome Conference, which set out the principles of the reform and asked for the protection of the designation. I would like also to recall that Harold Ganderleaf, which was the first director of ICOM, was the coordinator of this publication. Let's spare you the details, but I would like to state a few facts. First of all, this reform was asked for, conceived and coordinated from 1932 onwards. Secondly, it was made independently from national traditions, with a link to natural sciences and without a perspective on the professions linked to creation. But the story went on in the Second World War with the Varnish controversy. As we know, Europe was divided in the National Gallery of London between two camps in 1946 and 1959. Anglo-Saxons were in favor of a complete removal, whereas Latins would only make it partially. This quarrel lasted 15 years and was achieved with the creation of the ICOM, where was the first peace agreement. In 1945, ICOM succeeded the International Office of Museums and with a committee for paintings and laboratories. But we had to wait until 1957 before this new subcommittee was created with the request of IIC, founded 7 years prior in London. In 1967, 8 years after the creation of ICOM, two subcommittees fused in order to form what we know as ICOM-CC. These institutions were major in the reform of the profession in post-war reform. In 1960, the new Secretary-General of ICOM, Paul Philippot, published a new article on the training of conservators, which relaunched the 30-year-old investigation by O'Brien. In 1961, IIC dedicated a section of its annual conference on the question. In 1962, ICOM dedicated the mission to prepare a report on the subject. However, its manager, Paul Cormont, died in 1965. And knowing that history does not repeat itself, the functioning of international organizations imposed the same procedures as before. They reached the same conclusions, and 33 years after the first project, the redefinition of the profession could finally be given to practitioners trained in schools. This solution slowly was adopted. In 1965, the 8th Assembly of ICOM decided on the constitution of working groups with the training of museum personnel. In partnership with ICOM, in 1968, the 9th General Assembly created a committee for training to execute this resolution on the basis of the previous agreement. In 1970, ICOM published a document on the designation of conservators or restaurateurs on the basis of Paul Cormont's investigation. Gertrude Tripp, its main author, acknowledged the thawing of the relations between ICOM and ICROM, while indicating that this was not just about historical monuments, linked to ICOM created after the adoption of the Venice Charter in 1964. Its redactors presented themselves as the heirs of OIM and then they came up with a Charter of Athens which did not really exist, but never mind. This was finally set in stone.
Un historien pourrait évaluer l'importance de leur contribution aux travaux du groupe sur la formation de l'ICROM.
We also have to add the Istituto Centrale del Restauro, ICR, Cesare Branly, had already published in 1963 a theory of restoration. The professional associations, as the IIC American group, as well as the Fédération of Germany's restorers were also provided with an ethics code. We could have a look at their contributions if we had more time. However, firstly, after the linguistic turn of the 1960s, we saw that objects had several meanings which justified their conservation and their restoration being given to professionals. Secondly, the paradigm of sustainability was emerging, and the field of skill of these professionals had to extend to the role of climate in risk prevention beyond these objects. I will not go into more details, but Janet Bridgeland can tell us more about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre. Can everyone hear me? Thank you for that really wonderful retrospective of the beginnings of discussion surrounding the definition. I was asked to speak to the development of the definition that was adopted in 1984, but in fact had been worked on by the training working group of ICOM-CC quite actively from 1978, as Jacques says, primarily spearheaded by Agnes Ballestrem and Christoph von Imhoff. So why was a definition being considered? At the time, the profession of conservator-restorer was not defined in most countries, and most practitioners were called restorers, regardless of the extent and depth of their training. Conservators were viewed as craftspeople compared with curators and conservation scientists who had benefited from formal academic training. There was also, I think there's already been some discussion about this informally and in the introductory remarks by the FFCR about the ambiguity surrounding the concept of conservator, particularly in non-English speaking countries, where conservator often equates to curator, museum director, or a department head, often in other countries. So the point of the definition was to set forth the basic principles and purposes, requirements for the conservation profession, to distinguish it from related professions and establish proper training requirements and professional qualifications, preferably at the university level. Now, why the term conservator-restorer? It's a term that can be applied in both French and English and was acceptable to most or all conservation practitioners and associations. It's also a compromise between conservator, which is generally used in English-speaking languages, and restorer, used more often in Germanic and Romance languages. I'll give a brief history of this period of the evolution of the definition. In 1978, the document by the German Restorers Association was first discussed in the ICOM working group for training of restorers at the Zagreb triennial meeting in October of 1978. It was subsequently submitted to the ICROM Standards and Training Committee in November in two languages, French and English at the time. In 1981, the Training Committee had published a revised English version in the preprints of the triennial meeting in Ottawa of ICOM-CC. And then finally in 1984, the amended definition was presented at the triennial meeting in Copenhagen and voted on, although as Gael will note, there was no discussion. It was a straight up-down vote at that time. So the purpose of the definition is to address these are really the sections that are outlined in the document, and the URL you see at the link at the bottom of the page on the ICOM-CC website will take you to the brief document as a whole, which begins with an introduction outlining the purpose of the document, detailing the activity of the conservator-restorer, then the impact and ranking of the activities of those engaged in the profession, how it is distinct from related professions, and what should constitute training and education of the conservator-restorer. The definition was distributed, disseminated in a variety of different publications in the early years, beginning with an article in 1978 in the International Journal of Management, Museum Management Curatorship, the Australian Institute for Conservation of Cultural Materials Bulletin in 1984, ICOM News in 1986, the ICOM newsletter also in 1986. And it's worth noting that in the current ICOM Code of Ethics, which I gather is under revision, but I don't know whether this particular definition is or not, the conservator-restorer is defined as museum or independent personnel competent to undertake the technical examination, preservation, conservation, and restoration of cultural property. And I would like to give a nod to the principal authors of the definition, without whom we would not have gotten to that point in 1984, to Agnes Ballström and to Christoph von Imhoff, who sadly we lost at the end of October of this year. I thought in the very brief closing it would be interesting to look at the evolution of the name of two different working groups in ICOM-CC, and the first being the training group, which began in 1969 as the training of restorers. And the group was taken over by Christoph and Agnes in 1978 as coordinator and assistant coordinator, respectively, and again at the time when they were very actively reassessing the definition of the profession. In 1984, it was renamed Training in Conservation and Restoration, and since 1999 has been Education and Training in Conservation. So as the day will indicate, and I think Gael's presentation also, there's been quite an evolution just over the last years in the definition. Another example, the Theory and History Working Group, which began in 1972 as Theory and History of Restoration, in 96 became Theory and History of Conservation-Restoration. In 2008, Theory and History of Conservation, and to which was added in 2017 Theory, History, and Ethics of Conservation. So with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Gael.
Okay. Je parlerai en français.
I will speak French.
Merci au traducteur.
Thank you very much to the interpreting team.
Je ne vais pas parler de l'activité.
I'm not going to talk about the
vous avez parlé actuellement de l'acteur.
Profession,
de l'activité.
but more, or rather,
2010,
I will talk about the activity rather than the professionals themselves.
a été faite, cette
in
terminologie
2010,
l'activité et non
terminology
l'acteur.
on
Et
the
je vous raconterai
action
un peu
executed
comment
rather
il
than
m'est
the
arrivé.
actor itself was
À Rio,
created.
en troisième assemblée générale de l'ICOMCC,
In Rio, at the 30th General Assembly of
Sousa est
ICOMCC,
présent, les traducteurs ont demandé que nous leur
Sousa
proposions
is present,
une
by the way.
terminologie parce
The
que tout ceci
translators
était
asked
extrêmement
for
confus pour
standardized terminology because this was extremely confusing to them,
En fait,
and
il y
this
a
was
deux
preventing
mots
them from carrying out their
qui,
work.
aujourd'hui, sont
There are
utilisés,
two words
qui ont été
that are used
utilisés,
today,
et les mots, d'une manière étrange, n'ont
and
jamais été
strangely,
définis par la
these two
profession.
words were never really defined by the profession.
Le board de l'ICOMCC
The board
a
of ICOMCC
telle terminologie.
accepted for this terminology to be written down,
Le problème, c'est qu'en 2005,
but the problem was that
à La
in
Haye,
2005, 3 years later,
on ne l'a même pas présenté à l'Assemblée
the terminology was so confusing that it was not even presented at the General Assembly. However, the board still requested for a task force based on the aforementioned text in 1984 in Copenhagen to agree on the terms that best illustrate today's activities of our international community. It had to be drafted in French and in English, no more than 5 lines, not from a theory of restoration like Cesare Branly, and it had to be understood by the broader public and the members of the profession. Very important. It had to be applicable to museums, but also to movable and immovable heritage. This was crucial. A task force was therefore set up, a multilingual international task force with different backgrounds, different trainings, art historians, archaeologists, architects, conservators, restorers, and scientists. This was the team. What was their working method? Their duty was, first of all, to collect all types of actions a professional was able to execute as part of conservation restoration. Regroup those actions according to their objectives. The goals were absolutely crucial. Thirdly, we have to give a name to those objectives. The task force also had to collaborate with the IIC, CEN, and also a special guest I will mention later. We had a very precise schedule over 3 years. Thirdly, all communications had to be carried out through mails, so in written form. For the first 2 years, we had to inform the board constantly, keep constant contact with the 26 coordinators, present all the results in the GCI in 2007, when the final document would be drafted and presented to the General Assembly in 2008. So we used the different terms, for example, ventilate, organizing, desalinate, reintegrate, retouch, etc. And we had a huge word salad, and we had an English-speaking guest who said that this was very complicated. So, could we create some order? And I have to say that this guest had this very brilliant idea of putting everything back in order. Thanks to our distinguished guest, we had 3 groups of objects, of actions: to retouch, reshape, repaint, reintegrate, glue, disinfect, deacidify, desalinate, disinfect, remove weeds, and so on. Involve the public. The first group was the second group DDD, and the third group was the rest. Then we had to define these different actions and their goals. In the first one, the reason was the work no longer transmitted its richest message. So what was the objective? What was the goal? We had to find a new readability to the object, an aesthetic aspect, a historic state that was lost due to a past aggression. Secondly, destruction is actively taking place on the work at the moment. So we had to prevent this aggression and bring it back to a stable state. In the green group, we had to avoid, block or control a possible future aggression. This was the basic idea. So then we had to look at where these words occurred in different publications. You can see the different publications. On top, and the different terms on the left. AC 1994 used 4 terms, whereas ADL 2000 used conservation restoration. But this was the only term. And what we found out is that we did not have 18 words, which you can see on the screen. From direct conservation to ultimately non-interventive conservation. The collection care is only for collection, not for monuments. We even invented preventative conservation. So this was quite rough. There were only actually 3 important terms. And because of that, in Los Angeles, we showed this to the rest of the working groups. And in 2007, ICROM gathered for the first time to select these 3 keywords, which were the following: restoration, remedial conservation, and preventative, or preventive conservation. These are slightly different in French. This was quite difficult and required a lot of effort from Anglophones and Francophones alike. So we came up with an agreement on restoration, restauration in French, conservation, conservation in French, but we did not agree on or rather, we agreed on preventive conservation, but not remedial conservation. And we needed an overarching term. Once again, we did not come up with an agreement. Conservation in English, conservation, restauration, conservation, restoration, French. In 2008 in Delhi, at the 15th General Assembly of ICOMCC, the final document was presented to the board, first of all, on Saturday. On Sunday, following the agreement of the board, there was the coordination with the 26 working group delegates, and on Monday, at the plenary session, the terminology was accepted by 91% of the members of the Assembly. But we have to go much further. ICOM, as a whole, had to accept this term. It's about 3,000 of us. ICOM is about 50,000 people. So the following year, in Shanghai, the terminology was accepted by 97% of the members of the Assembly. But the European Committee for Standards was very important also. And it accepted it for monuments, archives, libraries, and museums. It was translated into German, Dutch, Greek, Swedish, and so many other languages. This was a long, long walk towards this partial agreement, partly in the Congress, partly in our bar. Thank you very much.
Aussi, il m'a aidé à mettre ça un peu en forme et en couleur. C'est un de mes collègues.
Thank you very much to Maurizio, my colleague, for putting this in
Voilà.
colors. Thank you very
Vous
much.
connaissez les textes principaux.
Now you know the main
Vous
texts.
connaissez l'action. Je crois que sur l'action, il
You
n'y a pas
know
grand-chose
the
à dire.
actions. There's not much to say about the actions themselves. We can always retouch, as
L'important,
so to say.
c'est que c'est valable.
But these are just words. What is important is that they are valid for museums, but also the whole of movable and immovable heritage. Let's not forget this detail.
La parole est à vous.
Now, I'll give the floor. Thank you very much.
Merci, merci Eleanor.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Si la salle réfléchit encore aux questions, j'en ai une parce qu'on a parlé de quelques termes sur les actions. Et tu insistes sur le fait que ces actions sont valables pour tous les secteurs et que tu as cité. Mais au fond, quel est l'objet ? Est-ce qu'il y a un terme commun pour désigner tous ces objets ? Alors évidemment, en France, il y a le code du patrimoine, il y a l'héritage.
How do you regulate those? We have a heritage code in France.
C'est une question juridique.
But I think this is a bit of a legal question, and maybe the next speaker will be able to answer some of those questions. Is
une œuvre d'art,
if you have a piece of cultural property, a work of art, a monument, how does all of that fall into a single category that is heritage? And are these conservator-restorers, are they curators or not? So I think it's coming back to standards and what it is exactly that we work on. Just a musing that I had.
Allez, allez, chauffez, hein. Allez, allez, oh, on s'est réunis pour parler, hein. Pas pour nous entendre seulement. On va avoir votre point de vue, si vous n'êtes pas d'accord, si vous n'avez pas compris.
We'd like to know if you agree, if you don't.
Donnez votre point de vue. C'est vous les professionnels.
Please, I mean, you are the professionals here. Good morning, David Queco. Can you see me?
Contributeur au Seine.
I'm a contributor at the Seine, and I was the French delegate to ECHO and a member of the FFCR over 25 years. Now,
la Confédération européenne,
ECHO, the European Confederation of Conservator-Restorers, so professional conservator-restorer organizations.
La division en trois parties de l'activité,
Now, Gaël gave us a three-part view of the profession, and
n'apparaît pas le terme stabilisation.
And the word stabilization doesn't appear. But this was important to us at the CEN. I think in 2006-2007 we started talking about this general terminology, and we did refer to the work that ICOM-CC was doing, in particular the 84 definition, but that three-part definition of an activity that pertains to cultural heritage, conservation. Well, actually, the 93 ECHO text does talk about remedial, preventive, and restoration. It is already a part of ECHO texts, and so it was already very clear in the 84 text. But the question is, what would the umbrella term be? What would the general term be that brings together the various strands of these activities? Because under conservation restoration, the professionals in that field believe that they directly intervene when it comes to objects.
d'autocritique, je dirais, de considérer tout ce qui est prévention,
And
puisque ça évite d'avoir à travailler derrière, à réparer.
so there's a question as to prevention in that respect. The preventive dimension actually has always existed, but under conservation restoration, it's usually about people who actually intervene when it comes to objects. But conservation restoration, it seems, is much broader, given that actually some people intervene indirectly through preventive action. So in France, for instance, when you say conservation, it's not very clear. Are we talking about material conservation? Are we talking about acquiring objects, research, and conservation? That is the problem, in my opinion. And I think that there's also, obviously, the legal side, where conservator is a specific administrative term, although in our museum legislation, it's not a term that appears. Just a thought. I hope it's helpful.
Oh, pardon. Juste un détail. Il est sûr que dans les mots que j'ai mis
Now, you know, of course, I didn't list every single word. I just wanted to give you an idea of what I meant. Of course, you could add any number of words to this slide, in addition to the 15 that I put on my slide. But I just wanted to show you that the dialogue was based on facts. When the microphone problem. When we realized that whether you were Norwegian, Brazilian, Spanish, or from anywhere else, we all agreed that there were three major categories of action. Now, you might say this is not 100% accurate and so on, but now this is what we've settled on, and we can't change our minds every 5-6 years. We can't have the working groups come up with something new every 6 years. We need to think long term. And I do realize, and I'm sure you do too, that one of the working groups in France today is still called just conservation, whereas it should be called conservation restoration.
Oui, bonjour.
Good morning. Marie Berducou.
Retraitée, on va dire.
I'm retired.
L'Université de Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne.
I used to be part of the Panthéon-Sorbonne Paris 1 University, the first French university to create a training program for conservator-restorers. And I was a part of the working group that Gaël mentioned, and I'd like to share a personal perspective. Now, we sought to define these actions, as Gaël said, and I would say that we also tried to reflect a disciplinary field that we named in French conservation restoration, that brought together the three major sectors in which we take action in order to preserve our heritage durably in a way that is most meaningful. So we have restoration, remedial remedial restoration and remedial conservation and restoration. In any event, coming back to the umbrella term, I think that conservation in French is the one that perhaps best reflects these strands and perhaps the disciplinary field in which we work along with others. And I think that sometimes is a sticking point. Why did we decide within this working group, at least for the French speakers, why did we settle on conservation restoration? Well, because in France,
Et le métier qui marche avec, le métier de conservateur, sont réservés à une catégorie professionnelle qui est responsable, qui sont les gens responsables des collections de musées en France et dans un certain nombre d'autres pays francophones.
And that is the case in a number of other French-speaking countries, not all of them. But in some French-speaking countries, a conservator is actually a curator. So in order to make that distinction very clear between conservators who have a general duty to preserve collections, in order to distinguish conservators from curators, we decided to settle on conservator-restorers. So that's one disciplinary field, conservation restoration, and within that we have a number of different stakeholders. They are not museum curators, they're not museum directors. These are terms that may be used elsewhere, but not in France. And within that field, there's two types of people, conservator-restorers, and what we are calling preventers. And so all those who do remedial conservation and restoration have taken into consideration the importance of prevention. But we now have preventers who de mesures concernant la prévention focus on prevention in the realm of cultural heritage. De la logistique, and so they work in logistics, in climate specialists, collection management, and so on. And in that subcategory of conservation restoration, in that category of preventive conservation, under conservation restoration, we have the same goals as professionals who actually have a slightly different job. So you have what we're calling preventers, and then on the other you have conservator-restorers, who have also included prevention measures in their own line of work. So basically, what I mean to say is, let's not confuse issues related to terminology on the one hand, and on the other, the actual jobs that people are doing. So it's important to distinguish the fields, the fields of work and the actual professionals. And I think the time has come now, in particular for France and a number of French-speaking countries, to actually move past these terminological issues. Because at the end of the day, it's about a different interpretation of our common goals. And of course, we all have to make do with the traditions that we inherit. Thank you.
Ceci dit, si je peux juste, peut-être qu'on a une
Thank
minute,
you.
parce qu'en tant que lecteur, non pas acteur, j'étais absolument pas là. Quand même, je me suis toujours posé une question par rapport à ça.
I'm just a researcher, so I wasn't present. I was doing my PhD when you published your document, and it was like an epiphany. I was finally able to name this field.
Avec cette approche, disons, action pragmatique.
But I also faced an issue. So given your pragmatic approach, focusing on actions and processes, and this is a question that I'm still sort of asking, is can this truly be referred to a disciplinary field? Because, you know, then we start talking about interdisciplinarity and so on. So is it a disciplinary field? And also, what of the difference between discipline and job.
Discipline, je comprends tout à fait qu'il y ait cette approche, qui pour moi, encore une fois,
for
n'est
me,
pas pareil, parce que,
I understand the approach.
Pour revenir sur la question de discipline,
To come back to your question, coming back to the Pavia Declaration, which said that conservation restoration should be recognized as a discipline, that of conservation restoration.
On dit en
And then
2008-2009,
in 2008, 2009, and then later in Shanghai,
et le terme chapeau,
we used conservation restoration in, as the umbrella
le document de
term in
l'ICOMCC et le
French.
document de Pavie.
But the problem is,
pour moi, encore une
with
petite
the
question à résoudre,
ICOMCC document
sachant
and
que,
the Pavia document, for me there's still a question mark. And the first time I met Gaël,
qui est l'inventeur de la rhétorique en Grèce dans
he
l'Antiquité par Aristote,
quoted
cet inventeur de la rhétorique dit peu importe le mot quand la chose est claire. Donc bon, on
who says, you know, who cares about names if it's clear what it is you're talking about, to paraphrase. And
on a un domaine d'activité
is it an interdisciplinary field or is it an interprofessional sector? Could I please take the floor? My name is Agnès Gallo.
Par rapport à mes diplômes, puisqu'il n'y a pas de féminin, donc je suis restaurateur du patrimoine.
I am
a master en conservation préventive.
Restorer in France, and I also have a degree in prevention.
Par rapport à ce que vient de dire Marie,
and just to respond to what Marie just said, I think that we shouldn't forget the collection managers and the technicians who also are a part of the museum profession. And I just wanted to share with you how I use this New Delhi document. Now, I lead a conservation restoration lab specialized in photography for the city of Paris, and very often we meet people who aren't familiar with our field. And I use the New Delhi document.
Et je parle du terme de parapluie de conservation. Explique que nous, on est un petit peu comme un hôpital.
And I use this umbrella term of conservation restoration. I say that we're a bit like a hospital, and so we do preventive conservation, remedial conservation, and then for restoration, I say it's a bit like plastic surgery. That is to say, it's not essential, and very often we use the term in French to actually refer to the entire range of actions. And sometimes when you say that you're a conservator-restorer, people don't understand, and so they prefer to refer to you as a restorer in France. So that's my own personal experience. But I do also have a question about the definition, the New Delhi document. Why? How did this very French problem, how was it exported to the rest of the world? In Spain, you say conservador-restorador. Even though the word conservador is not used as it is in French. And why are we using it? And you see it in English as well. Conservator, restorer. I'm just confused about how this issue was exported abroad as well.
Oui, alors je voudrais tout de suite peut-être rebondir sur l'intervention d'Agnès.
I just wanted to respond to what Agnès just said.
J'ai peut-être
exported. Well, maybe I was a little simplistic earlier. I said in France, the problem was that conservation refers to curation, or at least from an administrative standpoint, it refers to a specific line of work.
Des groupes de travaux qui ont conduit à la définition de Copenhague 1984.
That also led to the 1984 Copenhagen definition.
Le fait d'accoler conservation à restauration,
the fact of bringing together conservation and restoration,
au niveau vraiment du sens des mots, une manière
it
de se
really
démarquer,
pertains to the meaning of these words, and just as Pierre Levaux was saying earlier, it's a way of making a distinction with the creative professions. They have know-how, they have their own traditions,
de refaire à l'identique.
As such, they can reproduce, they can make identical copies.
Dans une continuité des traditions artisanales.
Actually,
alors que les conservateurs-restaurateurs
they're actually able to carry on a tradition. Whereas a conservator-restorer preserves the original materials that constitute the object and give it its historicity, because we do live in a world where history is granted a great deal of importance, and as is authenticity, the authenticity of the materials used, which are a part of our cultural heritage.
Été très longtemps celle des gens qui se penchaient matériellement sur les objets qu'on voulait
being able to draw that distinction with the creative professions
d'une certaine façon et qui éventuellement allait renouveler constamment en partie par partie au fur et à mesure de leur altération. Donc c'est une vue qui est tout à fait
The interpreter apologizes, but there are sound issues in the room. And so I do have a great deal of admiration for these professions, which require knowledge of the various techniques used in the various traditions.
Prédominante d'ailleurs dans certaines cultures n'est pas celle qui
domine,
en tout cas dans la culture européenne,
certainly
dans la perspective européenne que
isn't
nous
the
avons
dominant approach in the European culture, where we want to pass on a heritage that is materially authentic, that is whole, and its identity is central to that approach. So, bringing together these terms, conservation and restoration, everywhere, including in Spain, that was a question, and it that reflects a desire to say, well, there are many ways of approaching our heritage, and there's those that highlight the preservation of the original materials, and that is conservation, restoration, and then there are other types of lines of work more related to the creative professions. But Pierre Levaux talked about interdisciplinary or interprofessional fields. I think that maybe that leads us into more philological or philosophical debates that aren't actually very productive. We're working in this field, which is interdisciplinary by nature, yes. So it is an interdisciplinary field, but if you think about the object, the methods, and the goals, well, it is a disciplinary field. But of course, it's not a scientific discipline as Kant would have defined it. It's not quite that.
Juste pour dire un mot sur cette distinction que j'ai
évoquée,
je crois que là, nous sommes entre vous êtes spécialistes, donc vous avez des disciplines, des compétences, on n'a pas encore entendu, c'était le sens de ma question sur le patrimoine et l'héritage. On n'a pas encore entendu le juriste.
That was my question, actually, and we haven't heard from the legal experts. So,
une discipline, c'est une connaissance aussi.
A domain is where law is made. And a discipline reflects specific ethics and a specific qualification. And so I'm interested in the legal layer.
Le patrimoine est une catégorie juridique quand on voit un peu l'histoire de la notion. C'est en ce sens que je voulais faire rentrer, enfin que je posais la question, outre pour aussi des questions de simplification de la classification. Mais encore une fois, si l'intervention suivante est consacrée au droit, je crois que c'est pas pour rien, c'est pas inutile.
Might be able to answer some of those questions, but I agree that it's a bit Byzantine. I've lost all my hair working on this.
Très courte.
Just a final comment. This is David Queco. I think that the disciplinary field is no longer a question. The actual question, and in response to Agnes, it was in the Romance languages that the issue was raised, not just French. And at the level of the CEN, the issue for France and for other languages was to be able to make that very clear. And to come back to the French case and the Copenhagen definition, in France, we cannot be just conservators, nor can we be just restorers. And in French, when you're a restaurateur, that means you own a restaurant. So we're neither conservators nor restorers. So where do we stand then? I think that might help segue into the legal aspect. I see that there are two people who would like to take the floor, please.
Merci.
Thank you.
I'm Patricia Engel from Austria, and I would like to add that the question of being a discipline has not only the legal aspect, but also a philosophical. And from the philosophical point of view, I hope I don't oversimplify, but I would say personally, when you have a theory, which is a system of ideas based on general principles to explain the thing outside of using the words itself, which we have since the 1950s, it's a discipline. That is what my ideas.
Merci. Je vous demande pardon. Et nous avons...
Thank you.
Je vous remercie de m'avoir invité. Je ne suis pas du tout dans ce domaine dont vous parlez.
Et
je m'occupe du patrimoine culturel immatériel dans le cadre de la Convention de 2003 de l'UNESCO. Alors, je travaille auprès de pêcheurs, de prud'hommes de pêche en Méditerranée, c'est-à-dire des personnes qui sont élues pour administrer les pêches locales. Donc effectivement, c'est une pratique de droit.
People who work in the administration and are in charge of fisheries and work closely with fishing communities. And I want to talk about conservation practices on the coastline. And so here we're dealing with something that is intangible and which needs to be maintained in the best possible state. Now, the speaker was talking about creativity, but in the conservation work that we do on the coastline, there's no creativity, but the fishing communities need to constantly adapt their practices and their traditions based on climate change, changes in biodiversity, different types of parameters. But the support that is given to these people actually doesn't have a name. I've actually retired and the profession didn't have a name, and there's no reference to this profession in the UNESCO Convention. It says the community needs to maintain and restore its intangible cultural heritage. But that community doesn't have the training that you refer to. So, and this is a request, there is a fishing museum in Palomos, and we discussed this at length with the museum director, is which aspects of fishing should be preserved for the future, and what of past fishing practices that are no longer used today. I just, like I said, this is a bit of a request. I'd be interested in having you think about this type of work as well in the field of intangible cultural heritage.
Je vous remercie. Nous aurons l'occasion de discuter.
Thank you. I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about intangible cultural heritage this afternoon during the roundtable. I do hope that you'll join us. I can't, I'm sorry. Well, you can watch it on YouTube as well. I suggest that we conclude now. Thank you to the speakers. I apologize, I didn't put any water bottles on the table. I'll do better next time. And I now give the floor to Vincent Negri from the Institute of Political Science.
Gaëlle. Je passe la parole à Vincent Negri, Institut des sciences politiques.
I'll now give the floor to Vincent Negri, the researcher at Institut des sciences politiques at the INS Paris-Saclay, about setting a name and a standard for a profession.
Bonjour, donc,
good morning. Pierre Levaux has invited me to talk in a way as well, to put a layer of legalese on this all. So, what do we mean by setting a name and a standard for a profession? What is a name, what is a norm? Of course, we are going to talk about it later, but this picture is a cactus that has been with me for about 2.5 years. In autumn 2021, I was saying that at the time, the place of conservation and restoration was a thorny subject. And it is also a personal note, since this is in the garden of Melody Castaldi in Naples, who I had the pleasure to work with about 2 decades ago. So, why this title? Simply because among legal experts, as Olivier Jouan-Jean pointed out in his treatise Normé, is saying that giving a name is giving it a legal entity. So this is all about how the law will qualify, will name something. There will be, therefore, legal consequences. And from this thread, I'm going to draw out my presentation. There will be 2 different parts in my presentation. First of all, how this question exists in the code of heritage in French law at a macro level. So how does this kind of law work? And from this, what are the professionals? Secondly, I will be tackling the history from 1984 and how everything was built progressively with the influence of European Union law, which is also what we want to talk about today, because we have to find a balance between different regulations of the profession.
Et donc, ça veut dire que dans ce cas-là, on est exactement
naming is regulating, and therefore we have to make standards following the 2005 and 2006 EU law. So what is the normative economy, the normative economics of the Heritage Code? It relies on 3 different levels. First of all, in France, since the 19th century, and perhaps even a bit before, the state government has instituted itself as, progressively, the exclusive holder of public authority, of public power, so to say. So the state has the authority to ensure the conservation of national heritage. We do not see it as a contract, but rather as a form of prescription, a servitude, let's even say, which will directly impact or at least govern the conservation of heritage. And of course, Jacques, we could refer to Théodore Reinach's matricial law of 1913 and the preliminary report published in 1912. So there is, on the one hand, the owner, and on the other hand, the state. It is a co-ownership that is somewhat asymmetrical, of course. Both are not equal. The state can intervene, can even expropriate, impose its will, or even a special servitude, which we call public utility servitude in French law. And from this principle of public utility, public usefulness, this is what you can see on the screen. The legitimacy of the state, of its posture, is not put into question. On the 7th of January 2000, the European Court of Human Rights said that the states were legitimate to undertake such actions. So this is still very much relevant. We also have to read between the lines what this court said, that this actually says is that there's a principle of proportionality. And the action has to be proportionate with the goal to be reached. Second important thing, the fact that the owner bears the cost of conservation measures prescribed by the state. And this is how it's gone on since the 19th century. And this brings us to the second part of Leblon and Chastel's sentence, saying that heritage can be recognized by the fact that its loss is a sacrifice, and that its conservation implies sacrifice for the owner, and that is very important. But this shows us how this all works. There is a confrontation between the state and the owner. So this leads to another question. How far can the state intervene and impose its will upon the owner? As René Rivet wrote, as part of the quietas case, there is a balance to be struck, and when this balance is upset, there's a right to compensation. This was instituted very quickly in French law, for example, in 1935, for historical monuments. This is what parliamentarians called fiscal immunity or tax immunity, which is a way for the owners to handle the charge a bit better. So there is this confrontation, as I said, but what is missing in the last level is that the Code of Heritage also mentions qualified personnel. When it comes to conservation, the question can be answered relatively easily. We see in the Code of Heritage that there is a reference to chief architects of historical monuments, to the institution of architects in France. And those who are specialized in architecture with the diplomas delivered by Chaillot and other legal schools, the question is quite easy to answer, as I said. There is a 2009 decree that sets out the different prerogatives between the different remits between the different professions when it comes to restoration, conservation, and so on. When it comes to immovable heritage, the question is a bit more ambiguous. And Pierre Levaux recalled that under the League of Nations, in 1932, a text was adopted on the restoration of artworks. There were three consequences. The first one is that training centers had to be set up. Secondly, these had to be provided with laboratories for most of the disciplines, as Pierre was making the distinction. And thirdly, operations on these items of heritage had to be restricted to professionals trained in these training centers. So this is 1932. But it shows that the question that we have today was already quite relevant at the time. And this is what Member of Parliament Raphaël Gérard is going to talk about later today. So when it comes to immovable heritage, if I make a list of all the terms that appear, we see restoration, but we might see many others. And this is what Gaël de Guichin presented earlier, which is all part of the code. So this archipelago, this constellation of vocabulary, for a rather simple reason. Why is there not a stabler, more predefined vocabulary that is not spread out that way? This is due to the way the law was drafted in France. It was drafted in several silos. So, book 1, such or such thing, book 2, archives, book 3, libraries, and so on. Every different book is drafted differently, meaning that there is a codification by categories since 2004. Meanwhile, in Italy, protection measures were at the source of the codification. So case law was quite important in Italy, making it much simpler to have a more restricted vocabulary, unlike in France. And this is also linked to the distinct histories of the two countries when it comes to heritage law. So we could have a look at how this is formulated in the different books. When it comes to archives, no formulation. Libraries are the same. However, when it comes to museums and archaeology, there are already, as we can see, different ways to formulate things. There is no uniformity when it comes to the professionals who operate on, so to say, immovable heritage. Although when it comes to archaeology, there could be a distinction between movable and immovable, but that is a matter for another day. So there is a distinction, which was the reason for why we are here today. The denomination of Copenhagen, 1984. Conservator-Restorer. The second part of our presentation is the following. If we draw from the 1984 definition, the 1984 term, legal experts have this need to rely on texts and their evolution. And you can see that there are two occurrences in 1997, which was already mentioned. It's the Pavia document, and another one who David Queco referred to, and the one from the European Confederation of Conservators, Restorers Organization, Professional Guidelines in 2002. In these we can see very clearly that this is about confirming the trajectory that was initiated in Copenhagen. Maybe we could say there was a turn then in the goals that were set, because in the years that followed, there was the New Delhi Congress, as was recalled this morning. This terminological text was drafted where there was more focus on the activity rather than the professionals themselves. And this is what happened in Shanghai in 2010. Resolution 7 defined what was conservation restoration. As if in 2010 there was an acknowledgement of the fact that there is a low incidence of the fact that we've adopted the term conservator-restorer, and it seems rather uncontroversial looking at these texts. This seemed obvious to the drafters of this resolution, saying that most of these operations had to be given to conservators-restorers, end of. As soon as a domain of activity is defined, there are professionals assigned to these. In architecture, there are architects, and so on. So this was the logic. But there is another question about the normativity circle, because we're looking at inter-expert talks, but if we stick to that, there's going to be no problem. They can standardize themselves, they can define the frame of their normativity, but how is this going to spread out on the previous levels? So the deciders, the owners, as well as the state government, which is at the source of scientific and technical decision-making. So these different texts are referenced in Sen's 2011 text, but not only. The European Standards Committee has an equivalent in France, FNOR, the France Standardization Organization. So as you can see, 15898 set out the main terms for conservation and restoration, and this is where we saw the terms preventive and curative conservation, or rather remedial conservation. For me, this is not such a good thing because it's a privatization process in law, and obviously, I am more in favor of the law setting principles rather than having organizations which are compensated for doing what they do. But this is just a little aparté on my own sensibilities, saying that law is a public matter and should be so. Anyway, the question is extended to another level, beyond the circle of professionals, as it was adopted by the Ministers' Committee of the Council of Europe in Limassol in Cyprus in 2017.
donc vous avez des annexes et vous avez une annexe sur
In
la conservation.
one annex of the document, there's
donc vous voyez bien que les choses là sont prises en compte finalement par les États membres du Conseil de
taken
l'Europe,
into account
dont je
of
rappelle qu'ils sont 46.
the cultural heritage.
Sur un champ relativement.
The Council of Europe has 46 countries, meaning that this is a rather broad statement. So we departed from a very restricted circle to an acknowledgement of conservation restoration by the states, and the ultimate, the last stage being its acknowledgement by the Council of Europe, which aggregates the intentions and goals of 46 states. But meanwhile, there is a parallel operation going on. What about the law of the community and the EU? Things are also going on that front. From 1993, the 1st of January marked the application of the Maastricht Agreement. Obviously, this was not the first iteration of European law, but this is what we're interested in today. Before Maastricht in 1988 and 89, there was, I want to say the adoption, but this is not quite the case. This adoption of two directives on the acknowledgement of different diplomas across European Union countries. And so there's a system of acknowledgement for qualifications. And this led to the 2005 transition towards qualifications as a word. And still in the context of the EU, when it was still the European Community, there was this specific case on the following question: was the restaurator profession, as it was called back then, a regulated profession? And this led to a case opposing a candidate to the head and the Museum of Prado. The candidate was not of Spanish citizenship, or rather she had dual citizenship and studied abroad. So she was refused as head of the Prado Museum. She then sued Prado at the European Court of Justice, and she won because of this standardized diploma acknowledgement system. And the court says, yes, this is a regulated profession, and it shows the proof. But regulating a profession needs reserving this profession, restricting this profession to a category of professionals. Therefore, there is this imperious motive of general interests, of public interests, being the conservation of heritage. So this is not in order to protect the profession, but in order to protect the heritage, first of all. And this is what the European Court of Justice recalled 25 years ago. 2006, the Service Directive, after the Directive on Professional designations in 2005. In 2008, there's another directive which acts as a sort of umbrella on the way we can introduce regulated professions within states or not, because this is the red line, so to say, the line in the stand between the rather liberal sensibilities of the European Union and the state laws. So whenever there's a decision, public interest is always put forward in order to build this interaction between the regulated profession and the end goals. So the 2018, not 2008, directive on the introduction of a regulated profession says the following. According to case law in the European Court of Justice, among the public interest motives, there is the preservation by the state of artistic and cultural heritage. Why do I say by the state? Because this question falls in the principle of subsidiarity rather than being EU-wide. So there's a balance between the competence of the jurisdiction of the states and the EU law, which will fix limits when it comes to defending the European common market and the circulation of goods and people starting from 1993 in Maastricht. So today we have this road towards the creation of a protected designation. And this is exactly what Raphaël Girard is working on, so that this profession, at the service of the conservation of cultural heritage, is not just at the service of itself, as some said. Thank you very much for your attention.
Je vais remplacer Éléonore qui se
I'll replace Eleonore,
la présentation des différents
whose role was to present the different panelists, because she had to.
Et après l'intervention de Vincent Négri, on va avoir maintenant la présentation.
She had to greet one panelist. We now have Raphaël Girard, who is a member of the French Parliament in Charente-Maritime region, and is going to talk about a new law that will be discussed at the Parliament, and there will be the time for discussion and questions after these two talks. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good morning, everyone.
Donc, je vais essayer de me tenir à mes notes qui sont déjà assez longues.
I'll try to be as concise as I can, and I have quite a lot of notes. I just want to explain to you the history of the evolution of our work with FFCR for quite a number of years now. This is the fourth Ministry of Culture and the third General Directorship of Heritage we are working under, so there's a lot to be changed and redefined every time we change ministries. We are currently discussing with Rachida Dati's cabinet, current Minister of Culture. I'd like to thank you for this invitation to talk here about this draft law, which for my first mandate I have carried the Parliament and worked on very intensely, hoping that it will be voted next summer or next autumn. I have studied at École du Louvre in the 80s and 90s. And at the time, this debate was raging on around the notion of conservation restoration, which was part of the public debate to some extent. It had started being the case. And it was the subject of our trainings. This was the beginnings of preventive conservation. At the time, the Grand Louvre Museum was opening up, so scientific and technical equipments were developing effervescently. So there was a lot of talk about this subject, where the community remained blocked on the question of conservators, restorers, yes or no. For some, the ambiguity was too high, and this whole ambiguity was described very aptly by the previous panelists. so I will spare you the details.
Depuis 2017, qui est le début de mon premier
Since
mandat,
2017,
impliqué au sein de la commission
the beginning of my first mandate, I have been involved in cultural affairs and public education on the subject of heritage specifically.
Mobilier et patrimoine immatériel aussi.
Both material and immaterial. It has become my speciality within the Commission.
Et d'autre part, c'est des sujets
And on the other hand,
que je suis de façon globale,
these are topics that are close to my heart, that is rarely followed by the Cultural Affairs Commission.
Premier mandat 2017-2022, il y avait un fort
So during my first mandate, there was more emphasis on national education strategies and nothing about heritage. I was the only one bothering about it. And during my second mandate, starting in 2022, there was a huge bias for sports and the Olympic Games for obvious reasons, which are taking over every other topic in the conversation.
In
2018, I was tasked with co-reporting with another member of parliament from the Hérault region. Back then, the Prime Minister was Édouard Philippe, and the report was on the arts professions. So as part of the audit commission on this legitimate subject, I would like to emphasize its legitimacy because this was the start of a new war, so to say, when the Conservateurs-Restorers were added to the list of arts professions in 2016. This brought a lot of ambiguity and a lot of quarrels. And this is due to the fact that ambitions and goals are not necessarily the same in different commissions and different institutions. So in 2017, we came up with a consensus with the Ministry of Culture on the fact that we needed to move forward. The first idea was to follow a regulation path within the remit of the Culture Ministry specifically. Then the idea came up to write it down into the law, into the code. So this is why we started working on it on one side, and the Ministry of Culture did so in parallel, until we would come up with an agreement at the end of the road. So this was the idea behind our work. The Ministerial Working Group submitted its report in June 2023, so last year, to the Minister of Culture, Rima Abdul Malak, and in consultation with Minister Abdul Malak, we chose to draft a draft law, and the difference in French law, there's a distinction is between a French government law and a member of parliament law proposal. So today we have the latter going on. I am the main author, and there are also 50 co-signatories from every kind of political party. We wanted a cross-party initiative, because within each party there are pros and opponents. And this is not necessarily from an ideological point of view, but more a question of tensions with trade unions from the professions. And the lobbying was rather devastating with a few members of parliament. So we are trying to correct our path. We convened with the trade unions
en s'inspirant fortement de ce qui avait été
and redrafted the text on the basis of our talks
de réflexion sur le métier de conservateur-restaurateur du ministère.
and from the working group of the Ministry of Culture.
L'idée étant de trouver encore une fois
The idea
un
being
consensus
to find a consensus once again, which is a way to secure this professional designation. And it is not just a request from conservators. Overall, it is seen as better to find a standardized term when it comes to this domain, whether it is about monuments or immovable heritage, so that the practices, different practices are made clearer, especially when it comes to call for tenders. The case is often that people with master's degrees, whether meaning conservators, restorers, are called, and this poses a few problems.
Une expérience assez innovante, comme peut le faire le mobilier national, qui a une certaine liberté par rapport à la réglementation de la loi Musée. Le mobilier national a créé un programme de meubles de France.
So they basically restored furniture
avec deux catégories de
with two types of furniture that was being restored.
À répondre à la raison d'être du mobilier national, c'est-à-dire d'aller meubler les sous-préfectures.
Was basically intended to furnish prefectures, sub-prefectures.
Une armoire dans le bureau dans la chambre du
so,
préfet.
For instance, when you
le préfet a besoin d'y ranger ses petites affaires.
When you
donc,
put an old cupboard in the room of a sub-prefect, they need to be able to store their belongings in them, so they need to be functional, usable. However, these pieces of furniture tend to be old, and so most often they're either stored or they're used, they're displayed in exhibitions and so on. And so this furniture actually loses its function and becomes a museum object. So what did the Mobilier National do? Well, basically, where the furniture was still usable, then it was a woodworker, a carpenter, a craftsperson that dealt with those pieces of furniture, along with a conservator-restorer who provided advice and support, but didn't really step in as regards the actual restoration. But when the furniture, the piece of furniture couldn't be used, could only be used in an exhibition, then it was the conservator-restorer who took the lead, and the craftsperson only stepped in where necessary. And I think that perhaps is the future.
C'est un peu l'avenir de la profession.
The profession. That is to say,
les sociétés un peu importantes de restauration du patrimoine,
that major heritage restoration companies very often need support from a conservator-restorer in order to respond to calls for tender, which are increasingly complicated. I think that would also benefit from being reviewed. I think these calls for tender need to be standardized for such and such project. What are the skills that we need, for instance? Second, I'd add that that's a way to create jobs as well for conservator-restorers who may not wish to continue being self-employed in its various forms. I'm so sure you're aware of the different forms of self-employment. And so they could come in and support an organization that may need the expertise of a conservator-restorer. So the entire ecosystem is relevant here, and we have different entities which all have their own interests. So it's really about clarifying, structuring the field, the discipline, so it's beyond the actual designation. We want the entire system to be clarified.
Pardon. Je me suis perdu déjà dans mes notes.
Apologies, I seem to have gotten lost in my notes, but I'll just keep going. Now,
sur la restauration de Notre-Dame de Paris,
on the restoration of the Notre Dame Cathedral, I really insisted that any use of conservation, restoration, and perhaps this was nitpicking, but it was important to me that the hyphen be added. So those were 50 amendments that I made that concerned just the hyphen, so it may have appeared sort of obsessive, but it was important for me in the Heritage Code to be able to say that, and Notre Dame is a great example of the interdisciplinarity with conservator-restorers on the one hand and private companies on the other, working together, and I think it's working quite well. Now, I was the rapporteur for the monitoring of the Notre Dame worksite, but then I had to take a break for health reasons.
Sur la mission de 2018 sur les métiers d'art, on avait été confronté à des
Now, in 2018, on the issue of the métiers d'art, or the list of professions that can be considered as crafts, we talked at length about the conservation restoration on the one hand, and the idea of craftsmanship in France, the métier d'art, and it's really about the fact that craftspeople say, if we recognize these conservator-restorers, well, why not us? Well, first of all, there's the issue of qualifications. So, for example, gold thread embroidery in France, there's only a couple of entities in France. And so obviously the trade association isn't visible enough, and the only way for them to survive is to be subcontractors. And that know-how is disappearing as well, because no one, apart from this one entity in Rochefort, it's training people in this type of embroidery. And it's a very small market, it's Versailles, a few other castles, museums. The market is quite small, so that's another issue. And this was resolved in part because today you can get in-workshop training for these niche professions. Sometimes there are very few remaining active workshops, but this is one option, but it's quite limited.
Aujourd'hui, c'est encore limité à une fois. Je ne sais plus si on a déjà corrigé ou pas la capacité de changer d'élève si ça se passe mal, si l'élève abandonne en cours de route.
And it's not very clear what happens if the apprentice drops out. And so on, so that's not very clear, so that's a problem. And some of these apprenticeship centers, some of these training centers, vocational training centers, deliver specific types of qualifications. And sometimes the workshop itself becomes a vocational training center, and the artisan becomes a recognized trainer as well. So that brings me to the end of
Le sujet, c'était,
my contribution.
tout à l'heure,
but perhaps I'll come back to this part.
Donc, après,
coming back to the actual
compris à peu près 6 ans de discussion, de négociation,
draft law, following 6 years of debate, compromises, and given the various challenges described over the course of the first roundtable. What's in a name? That's the very subject of today's event. And you know, things haven't changed that much in the last 40 years. Of course, curators are less reluctant. So in France, because they're called conservators, they're less reluctant to have this term used.
Sur une formulation qui est certes un peu alambiquée.
And that brings us to a term that's perhaps not ideal, it's a little clunky, but it reflects the profession quite well, and an official title of a qualified conservator-restorer for cultural property. So it's quite a long title, but over all these years, I think a number of options were considered. We discussed engineering, but obviously the engineering schools said your schools are not engineering schools, so you cannot provide engineering degrees, which is surprising because there is such a thing as a heritage engineer in France, and that doesn't require an engineering degree.
Donc encore une confusion et un point qui fait
that just brings in more confusion.
Donc c'est la version qu'on a mis dans le texte qui n'est pas tout à fait définitive.
But in any event, no, this version is not final because we're waiting for the new minister and her cabinet to approve this. But so for the moment, we are getting this co-signed, and I would like this to be a multi-partisan bill. And actually, that's the case. We have MPs across the political spectrum joining us.
Voilà, qu'est-ce que j'ai oublié de vous dire sur la proposition de loi?
What else?
Donc en fait, il faut voir ça comme l'aboutissement d'une évolution de la profession.
This is really the culminating point of all the changes that we've seen in the profession. And I think Clémentine, I hope Clémentine will agree that it was long and quite painful, a long and painful process. Many people involved. And it is a sensitive issue, although a general audience may struggle to grasp exactly what's at stake. Some of my colleagues also say, you know, why are we even talking about
voilà,
this?
Donc aujourd'hui, tous les voyants sont au vert.
I think things are looking good.
We're
just waiting for the cabinet and the new minister to approve.
Et on envisage de déposer le texte dans les semaines qui
viennent.
And
the bill should be tabled in the coming weeks.
Qui pourrait se faire, mais il y a encore des incertitudes sur la feuille verte de l'Assemblée, qui est le programme.
And well, there's still
le programme des lectures et des
examens de texte. A lack of clarity on exactly when this will be debated in Parliament.
L'ours avant de l'avoir complètement abasourdi. Et enfin, c'est un enjeu économique.
Anyway, we're looking forward to it. And I also wanted to talk about the economic aspect of this.
La mission des conservateurs-restaurateurs.
Because that has helped us consolidate the actual function of a conservator-restorer. So that helps us really place them in an organizational chart in the sense that they have a master's degree.
Et c'est aussi assez rassurant pour les pour les maîtres d'ouvrage qui ont lancé des campagnes de restauration.
Is reassuring for worksite project managers or project owners. So, for instance, a local authority may find reassurance in knowing that that these conservator-restorers are there to support them.
Dans la mesure où on va créer fatalement des débouchés de salariat.
Professions as well. Again, this is likely to create jobs, salaried employment for those who wish. This is already the case, actually. Major,
qui se positionnent sur des très gros chantiers.
Companies in this field that work on major job sites. In general, they tend to have at least one conservator-restorer as part of their team when they prepare their bid, but also when they conduct the actual works.
Adapter leur méthode de travail pour y répondre.
And
they deuxième, alors c'est un texte de loi en 2 articles.
Their working methods. So the bill, as I said, has 2 articles. The first is about protecting this designation legally, and the second article is
un gros sujet, qui a été un gros sujet. Donc le dispositif existe depuis longtemps.
Is about recognizing work experience that has been acquired in the field, and so in the first year this worked very well. We had a number of candidates
à la validation des acquis d'expérience. Aujourd'hui, on est en gros, selon Charles
did not
sur
have
3 tiers. Un premier tiers de VAE qui se traduit par une réussite. Un deuxième tiers qui se traduit par un redoublement.
We are seeing increasing recognition of this experience. For a third of candidates, they are asked to repeat a year. And then we have a third of candidates who are rejected.
De candidats qui est quand même assez faible et à leur niveau de technicité. Donc je crois que
this remains quite a large proportion, and so I think that this text is an opportunity to review our approach to PLA. And a number of universities, Tours, Avignon, some others, which provides this master's degree. Out of them, only the INP and Paris 1 actually practice prior learning assessment.
Les 2 écoles provinciales étaient pas suffisamment solides, pas suffisamment...
Other 2 schools
oui, solides, on va dire, en termes d'équipe et de finances, pour assurer
now
cette
have the resources to also take that on.
Voilà, donc moi vous verrez dans le texte de loi si vous allez
and
le
you'll
regarder.
See, I mean, if you were to go take a look at this draft law. Oh, apologies, it's actually not online, but I'd be happy to share it with you. You'll find my email on the Parliament website. So this is still a draft. It's likely to change, in particular the introduction.
Ce qui est important à dire, parce qu'à un moment ça a été une crainte des syndicats.
What's important to say, and I think the trade unions were worried about this, and I'd like to say this officially, as it were. The idea is not to create a monopoly. So in the first version of this text, back in 2020, it wasn't very clear whether we were intending to create a kind of monopoly in the sense that it would block certain people from accessing the market. That's not what we're trying to do here.
Pas une disposition qui pourrait laisser penser que.
We want to make sure that that's not
très prudent. L'idée, c'est vraiment de consacrer le titre,
what
encore une
the
fois, pour le
text
placer dans
suggests.
l'écosystème de la conservation du patrimoine.
The idea is to maintain this designation of conservator-restorer.
Il n'y a pas d'idée cachée derrière.
And we don't have any hidden agenda, that is to say that companies can continue bidding as long as they meet the specifications of the call for tender, and they can continue to bid, but of course they need to have someone with a master's degree as part of their team. So I did want to stress that. And on the cultural side, well,
Ça a longtemps été un problème d'ego pour les
I often said that it was an ego-related issue. So, for instance, curators thought that restorer had a negative connotation, so they didn't wish the two terms to come together again, because in French, a curator is a conservator. So this was an issue for French speakers.
Et puis le deuxième point, c'est de faire en sorte, en clarifiant la position des conservateurs-restaurateurs, justement de clarifier tout l'écosystème des métiers d'art.
We also need to structure the ecosystem of what we call the métiers d'art, so the list of crafts in France. Make it clear who does what.
D'activité, que ce soit bien clair pour tout le monde.
So I did want to emphasize that we're not trying to create a monopoly on this designation.
Particulier aussi, mais c'est plus rare. De mieux accompagner
and we want to support local authorities when they select the people who will take on the restoration of the local church or the works of art in that church and so on. Coming back to the recognition of prior learning, in Article 1 we refer to a decree as to the list of certified establishments, so that's already the case in the museum's law in France. So the idea is to be able to amend the list in the decree rather than have to amend the law, because it's always easier to amend a decree. And the second article, which is about RPL, recognition of prior learning, again, we refer to a decree here.
C'est la démarche, en tout cas, dans laquelle sont engagés l'INP et
because the two establishments that I mentioned, INP and University Paris 1, when they select people based on RPL, they need to perhaps make sure they have access to initial training, because later they're trained in ethics, in physics and chemistry, and so on. And I'm convinced, as I always have been, but let's see how it goes when we start drafting these decrees, is I think that these students should be assessed in the same way that the regular students are assessed. That is to say that in their final year, they should be able to work on an object from a public or a private collection, but usually it's public. And so they work on it end to end. They're guided by someone from the INP on a restoration site. So understanding the state that the object is in, the type of restoration required, work that is done with the conservator or the person in charge of the collection. I think that can be a good way of assessing not only knowledge, which can be tested orally or in writing, but to see whether they have acquired the method that a craftsperson with 30 years of experience in their field may have acquired.
remise en cause.
It's kind of a knowledge that the hand has acquired through experience. And I think that what distinguishes one profession from another
permettent de mieux se comprendre en fait.
And I think that is at the core here, and I think that will help these professions understand each other better. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Merci, Monsieur le député.
Thank you to the Member of Parliament for this presentation. It was quite comprehensive, and thank you for working on this issue for so many years. I wish you every success. My name is Astrid Branly. I work at the Château de Versailles, and I work very closely with my colleagues from the Heritage and Craftsmanship Campus, which is right across from the Château de Versailles. And as the former director of the Restoration Department at the INP, I actually worked towards this partnership, in particular on this issue of recognition of prior learning. So we actually have a project with the INP. It's an in-depth training for RPL candidates, so that they can have the prior learning assessed in the best possible conditions. We have been working bilaterally with training managers on this campus, as well as potential candidates. And we're hoping to open up the first trainings as of September, with training in ethics, history of materials, various types of science-related subjects, physics, chemistry, and so on. We do hope that this will work. We are receiving funding from the Future Investment Program, PI4 as it's called. So we do have funding. Now it's all about implementation. And we'll be doing this with our INP colleagues. We're continuing to refine that, just for your information. But I do have a question, or we have a question, because as you said, there are these niche crafts which, for which we may not be able to apply RPL. For instance, gold work, or chair bottoming. And so I was wondering, how can we help these craftspeople also to work alongside conservator-restorers on public heritage as well, at different levels? Have I understood correctly? Yes. So thank you. I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on that.
Merci pour votre intervention, parce que j'ai effectivement oublié de parler de vous.
Thank you very much for noting this, because I forgot to talk about you actually, and I apologize. The way I see it, knowing that the ministry will also have its word to say, Versailles is a great place to look at recognition of prior learning. So I'm elated that you're working with the Institut National du Patrimoine, because this is the border between art, craftsmanship, and restoration of arts objects. So I see it as a great thing that you are associated. I'm waiting for the parliamentary debate to propose a few proposals, but this will be one of them. When it comes to the niche professions, first of all, this is about training. So maintaining this know-how in these professions and training the next generations is something very, very important. These are often self-employed, usually aged, elderly. So we are lucky enough to have a few, for example, bucket makers, some very specific jobs where one person is being trained as part of the maître d'art divisions, so the arts master system. And we have to support these people through the protection scheme, but also through delivering diplomas. As is today, we cannot create as many diplomas as there are specific crafts professions, but there can be some standardized form of diplomas which can be delivered by universities, but when it comes to the practice, it has to be validated somehow. Hence the idea of training in a workshop, which enables the delivery of a diploma and already puts the student in the mindset of getting a diploma and which kind of diploma they want. So these are the stakes in the debate that will be carried out on training specifically, and how we grade these training systems, at what level we put them. Because as we know, there are so few results, there are so few opportunities for some specific crafts that only one person is enough for the whole trade. But if this person disappears, then we're done for. And this is important when we want, for example, to defend these people against the competition of huge companies that relocate in China, for example. So a site like Versailles is particularly important because Versailles and others are the only ones left that defend these professions. I hope I responded to your questions aptly. Hello, I am Luis Souza from the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. I would like to congratulate both of you for your presentations, because following the first presentations, it seems that we have a presentation where there's a real standard that is set where all the conditions are met for a law to be drafted. And this is something I would like to talk about later when I'll be at the round table. But I think it's important to make contacts with Mr. Chirac, because in Brazil too we have a member of parliament who is responsible for these issues, and we've already moved forward in Brasilia about these things, so there's a lot that can be communicated about. I think that one more person requested the microphone in the middle. Hello, I'm no conservator-restorer, I'm an archaeologist, but I have a question regarding the law. In order to get the title, the designation, it's a master's degree in all four institutes, or is it also accessible to other professionals? And therefore, what is the difference between this title and the museum certificate, which is pretty similar, if I'm not mistaken? So when it comes to the designation, nothing changes in the French museum law. It is simply extended for all conservation, restoration for heritage and cultural goods. Otherwise, there are no changes. So those who are already part of this system are not do not have to be concerned with this evolution. Simply those who are in ancillary professions. The second part is about the other professions. So either recognition of prior learning is relevant, for example, for arts, crafts people who have been working for a long time and for some reason or another want to become recognized, certified restorer or conservator-restorer. So recognition of prior learning will be the way, and there are already a few provisions for very specific cases, for example, niche professions and others. But overall, we're staying on the same system, so either master's degree or recognition of prior learning. Some provisions are already provided in the law, so that not everyone has to request a VA recognition of prior learning. But this is mostly what it's restricted to. Thank you very much. There's another lady with a microphone, and this will be the last question for this morning. So, okay, 3 last questions. Good morning, Lucien Setbourg for the archaeological section of the Paris authorities. We have an agreement with the state which delegates the conservation of the Paris furniture heritage, because the city of Paris itself is not unable to to take charge of this 100%. So in these cases, how do we do things when the state does not handle its own responsibility in this region, for example? And for me, as a conservator-restorer, I have to also work as a preventer. My second question is the following. Sometimes members of these identities will blame these actors for safeguarding the heritage. So what do we do when it comes to this? When we try to follow these standards and we are blamed for doing too much. I'm a conservator-restorer. Is that what you actually call? Yes, that's what I am. Officially, for archaeological collections for Paris. And you're a civil servant? I am a contract agent. So we do not talk about every specific status. For example, those engineers that are integrated within ministries. So arts project manager, which are internal to the culture ministry. Hence the question of decrees, whether we need to extend the nature of the diploma or not. So this is a master's degree. Then you're part of the specific cases that are mentioned in the law, for which the title will be obtained rather organically, because you're already working with this civil service designation. So this is already provided in the first article of the draft law. For those who are already working in this designation, but do not necessarily have the diploma from the right schools. So there are 3 more questions. There's this lady in the center who's desperately trying to talk, so I'll let her speak first. Hello?
My name is Maria Gorodetska. I'm a professional conservator of wall paintings. And I just wanted to express my opinion because I think a conservator is not just a consulting organ. And I know there are many instances in France when a group of craftsmen work on very important historical monuments, just consulting the conservator. My question is why a group of professional conservators trained, having specific knowledge on the subject, cannot work on historical monuments instead of craftsmen. That's it.
Je sais pas. Vous avez la traduction? Je peux répondre en français ou...
I can respond in French, if that's okay.
Ah oui. Vous avez la traduction en français? Je peux parler en français?
So I can respond in French. Basically,
votre question,
if I understood correctly, your question is why. Just one moment. So, if we understood correctly, is why there's not a dedicated profession for consultants in historical monuments? Why do conservators intervene as consultants in a team of arts craftspeople? Well, I could say this is a misunderstanding. I'm not saying that conservators have to be restricted to the role of consultants. They will take on different roles depending on the project. When it comes to the restoration, the rebuilding of Notre Dame, this is a huge-scale project, meaning that several conservator-restorers had to be mobilized, necessitating specific technical know-how. What is important here is the multidisciplinarian approach. Because today we are operating too much in silos and in isolation, so we have to open the door to multidisciplinarity. And we have to acknowledge the intellectual dimension of restoration, as we call it in French. So, restoring is often seen as the manual approach without thinking of the ethical, historical perspective and so on. We see the gesture, the hand. But of course, this is not about preventing conservators from being restorers too. When it comes to sculpture, for example, the current system is working quite well with public and private commissions. Today, conservators restorers are often called on these kinds of projects, and this is not going to change anytime soon. But in some particular cases, it's good to recognize when one person does not have all the skills required, and the idea would be to call maybe 1 or 2 other people to complete the expertise. And this is what we debated about at the National Assembly about reconstructing the Notre Dame Cathedral. So should we... the question was, should we build it as was before, or was the Viollet-le-Duc peak not to be rebuilt? Did we have to come up with a more creative approach? There were 577 of us, and we did not manage to find a consensus. Eventually, the then minister decided, the government decided that this would be an identical reconstruction, which is by no means a tradition in France. At least this is not really the French tradition. So basically what we do is a pastiche, the reconstruction of a Viollet-le-Duc's version of Notre Dame Cathedral.
défendez-moi.
We could adopt another point of view, which was mine at the time of the debates, is that this fire was now part of the history of the monument. So we had to find a trace, we had to see a trace of this event in the future layout of the cathedral. The final choice was to restore it in a state that was prior to the fire. We'll see the result in a few weeks' time. I hope I responded to your question correctly, but I just want to say that we're not changing the Conservator-Restorer into a consultant, a mere consultant. It's just one more possible remit, one more possible prerogative, but you will... otherwise it will be business as usual, because you're already an important, even major part of the restoration sector. Thank you. I have a microphone for David.
Oui, bonjour. Moi, je suis Stéphanie Courtier. Je travaille au
Yes, I am Stéphanie Courtier, working at the Restoration Center at the France Museums. I'm working on gilded wood, especially. And I have two questions. The first question is the following. There are often subcontracts with craftsmen on specific collection projects, so that we can create a synergy with these craftspeople. You were talking about the fact that Versailles is going to develop recognition of prior learning, and there are further initiatives for equal opportunity between those who come from craftsmanship and want to obtain a master's degree in order to work in museums. And because of the way they studied, what they studied, were not made aware of this opportunity. So my first question, these people who are working for conservators-restorers, what will they be acknowledged as? Today, not all craftsmen work for museums. The clientele might be different between conservators and between craftsmen. So what would be the specific acknowledgement mechanism for these craftspeople? My second question is, often in their everyday activities, craftspeople do not have a lot of time to retrain. These technicians have extraordinary know-how. You were talking about niche jobs, for example, when it comes to gelders, but these this can be different. They could be working on different types of furniture, different types of woods, metals, and so on. So was there a reflection about these very specific know-hows and what categories they could be put in order to access recognition of prior learning? This recognition necessitates time. I do not hear the voices of craftspeople or people who are in charge of training centers. But I, for example, work in vocational training school for gilding, and I also work in a specific commission for ICOM-CC. I hear a lot of testimonies on these different profiles. So the question is how we can associate these artisans working for museums and what means are given in order for them to recognize their prior learning, what status they can be given. And I have a third question as well. What are the means allocated to them in order to give them time to follow these training courses, given that they have some financial needs to keep on working simply? Thank you very much. I'll ask you to be as concise as possible because we've gone past the allocated time, especially since you've asked three very rich questions.
c'est une journée dont la cible n'est pas tout à fait.
So we're talking about the training of craftspeople. As an aside, we're not really talking about them today, and this is why there are no representatives for these professions, especially. We'll just take one of these questions and then go on the break. I'll try to be as concise as possible as well. For these arts craftspeople, the law does not change anything. Only the recognition of prior learning will be slightly redefined in its contours. And you've mentioned the fact that the more these craftspeople are specialized, the more they are, well, the only people who are qualified for something, so they do not have a lot of time. Just following physics and chemistry lessons for 3 days has an economic cost. Seeing the precariousness professionally of these craftspeople. And when it comes to the technical know-how, these craftspeople already have well-tuned systems. For example, the meilleur ouvrier de France, the best craftsman in France system and competition.
Donc c'est comment on calibre la VAE pour qu'elle s'adapte.
But the question is, of course, how we calibrate the recognition of prior learning to adapt it to the economic criteria of the company they're working for. Because a craftsman has to keep working in order to exist. I guess that the training has to be more practical, more modular, maybe shorter, online. But this is not the subject of the law because nothing is being changed to what is done today for craftspeople.
Allô, allô. Oui, pardon.
Yes.
David Queco.
2 questions or maybe remarks. Mr. Girard, let's not come back on the term restorator, which is historically ambiguous. But the fact that they have a diploma in conservation, this is the title that already exists. They are part of the National Directory of Masters, and these are protected titles because nobody else has to nobody else is allowed to use these denominations. So the title, the designation is already protected. So every title from this directory is already protected. Is it necessary to make a law proposal then, to draft a law? My second question is for Vincent Negri. Wouldn't it not be useful or interesting, since the notion of heritage and the notion of conservation restoration are closely interlinked, and the latter notion does not exist anywhere else? Would it not be useful to integrate the notion of field of discipline, the terms remain open, into the Code of Heritage, especially in Chapter 1, saying that all the goods that are within the code are protected and therefore a part of jurisdiction in order to impose a certain number, a certain kind of work. So why not integrate this into this law, either as consultation or so on? When it comes to the professionals who carry this out, this is a different question. It comes to the regulation, the regulations and so on. But these first 2 notions are very much interlinked. So why was it not accepted into this code? Another question I have
D'abord, il n'y a pas que les
linked
métiers
to
d'art
the
qui ont besoin
training.
de formation continue.
First of all,
Tous les conservateurs
not
restaurateurs
just
ont aussi ce problème-là.
arts
Donc, il y a
professions
des financements de
need
formation continue quand
this
on est
kind of
sur un
training
marché très
and need the
concurrentiel
necessary funds,
avec des gens
but the market
indépendants.
is
Ça, c'est une première chose.
very
Et la
competitive
deuxième chose, c'est est-ce que
and the money
l'habilitation
is
telle qu'elle
scarce.
fonctionne aujourd'hui au service
Secondly,
des musées de France où une personne dans un bureau
the way it works
fait le
today,
choix de
where
ses
there's
compétences, comme ça, mais
one
est-ce
person
que
in
telle personne est habilitable ou pas habilitée,
an office, and
je
people decide whether
sur
he's
la validité de ce système par rapport à des schémas de VAE ou d'autres.
able or unable to carry out these duties. How does it work with the recognition of prior learning?
Vous répondez d'abord ou... alors pour revenir à votre toute première question.
So to come back to your first question.
En fait, c'est pour ça qu'on est là, c'est pour
This is why we are here, to be honest, in order to come up with a specific terminology, which, once again, is the fruit of some pretty heated discussions. So the French, with this French label of restorer, with a diploma in conservation, restoration for cultural goods.
Ils sont portés par ça. Après, si on reste accroché à un décret,
if we stay with the decree rather than anything else, this is because we see that we believe that other approaches could be carried out through other institutes. So we think we should have the capacity to add or subtract a specific training center. But this is the whole point of today. I'm just here to respond to a demand from the profession, or this is at least what I try to do. But here you appear to be questioning the idea of drafting a law altogether. So you're bringing us back to 2017, 2018. But I believe that now the decision has been taken and shared at all levels with all actors. Now is the time to act rather than ask such fundamental questions, and to finally entrench a term that does reflect our expectations quite well, and ensures that not everyone can just decide one day that they are conservation restoration specialists, or rather specifically conservators restorers. We know that some local chapels and churches with a variable level of success have so-called appointed conservators restorers.
Aujourd'hui, elle n'est définie dans la loi que pour les collections des musées de France, ce qui fait déjà beaucoup.
Today, the law only defines the profession for French museums, national museums, which is already quite a lot. This even includes private museums.
Pas mal de monde déjà qui doit suivre une procédure qui est décrite dans la loi.
This is a procedure that already has to be followed by quite a lot of people. And here we're clarifying the procedure
la formation initiale,
regarding the initial training, continuous training.
Et vous avez les mêmes problèmes que les artisans d'art qui sont
there's the same problem with arts craftspeople who are registering for recognition of prior learning. They are often self-employed craftspeople, not always, but this is often the case, and they have to provide for their company in order to live and eat simply. So we cannot afford to have procedures that take months. Sometimes it can be a whole reskilling operation, but these jobs are so different from one to another, on different materials and so on, that it is, I would say that it's almost up to the profession itself, the corporation to redefine their operations.
dès qu'une circulaire européenne
and the same problem exists in other
pour les entreprises
institutions.
un peu solides et un peu capées qui travaillent dans le bâtiment, mais
when it comes to the construction sector in general, the stone carver working for historical monuments is not necessarily going to be interested in broader construction training operations. We assume also that training centers with recognition of prior learning will open up their courses for those among the craftspeople who need to update their skills or maybe have a look again at some fundamentals. But this depends on the capacity that these training centers have to carry out these courses, including continuous training.
Ça existe un peu, il y en a au CNFPT, je crois.
There are some in the CNFPT school for
fonctionnaires territoriaux, les agents territoriaux.
Local agents or local civil servants.
Mais oui, sans doute, on est loin du compte. Mais encore
But obviously, we're far from finding the perfect answer. We are too far ahead in the process.
Deux éléments en réponse à ta question alors. Premier élément, ça tient à ce que j'expliquais, c'est-à-dire que cette codification qui était faite en silo, donc on a installé effectivement dans des expositions communes deux catégories d'expositions, des expositions qui étaient pour le coup vraiment communes à l'ensemble des patrimoines, c'est-à-dire par exemple la circulation, du contrôle de l'exportation.
There's one type
of exhibition
that covers every category of cultural property.
Dispositions qu'on ne savait pas mettre ailleurs.
We also have provisions actually that don't belong
un livre du Code du patrimoine sur le
else.
dépôt légal, encore qu'on
For
aurait pu,
instance,
on aurait pu mettre dans le livre 3, on aurait pu discuter, non, on l'a mis effectivement dans le livre 1,
of what's called legal deposit.
Articles, et donc ça ne justifiait pas de faire un livre entier autour du dépôt
Didn't
légal.
make sense to make an entirely
Et donc,
separate
après, effectivement, la question qui se pose, c'est on aurait pu tisser des mailles autour de ce qu'est la conservation-restauration et définir
We could have
la difficulté, c'est que c'est pas
spent
comme
more
ça,
time on
en fait,
the terminology,
c'est pas
but
comme ça à la fois qu'on pense le droit
that's not
et c'est
our
pas comme
approach
ça qu'on
to law,
l'écrit.
and
C'est-à-dire que
nor is it the way that we draft
parce
law.
que cette question-là, elle s'est posée dans la précédente version de la proposition de loi, effectivement, où on avait tenté donc de dire, mais voilà, on met en transversal ce qu'on entend par conservation-restauration, et on nous a opposé, mais ce qui était bien évidemment j'allais dire cousu de fil blanc, mais qui tente rien à rien aussi. Donc, à un moment donné, il faut quand même pousser parfois le fait qu'on ne peut pas mettre une définition qui n'est pas normative. Vous voyez bien, c'est pour ça que j'ai intitulé ma intervention « Nommer et normer ». On peut nommer, effectivement, à condition qu'il y ait des conséquences à tirer en droit. C'est-à-dire que donc, mettre une définition de la conservation-restauration toute seule, en quelque sorte, ne suffit pas. Voilà. Parce qu'on n'est pas dans les anglo-saxons ou les britanniques ont un common law.
The British have a common law system.
En common law, on pense le droit et on l'écrit différemment. C'est-à-dire qu'on commence, quand on écrit une loi, on commence toujours par définir les termes.
Think and write differently. So you always start by defining the terms in that system. So we actually have different legal traditions,
qui vont raisonner de manière totalement différente.
and our jurisdictions also approach the matter
Ça ne
differently.
figure pas en chapeau dans le titre 1, dans le titre 1er.
So that's why we don't have it under the chapeau of Article 1, but I would say that this draft bill is one way of achieving that horizontality and achieving the legal protection of this designation. Thank you.
Je propose que ce...
The mic doesn't seem to be working, says the interpreter.
Un dernier commentaire.
Was there a final comment? With the microphone, please.
Il va falloir qu'on puisse s'arrêter si on veut pouvoir reprendre.
I think we're going to have to take a break. So
remercions chaleureusement nos intervenants.
It just remains for me to thank our speakers.
Et moi, je voudrais remercier la FFCR,
And I too would like to
encore une
thank
fois, la
the
Direction générale du patrimoine, qui est
FFCR,
représentée par
the
Pascal
Directorate
Lévi-Strauss
General for Heritage, Patrick Levaux and Vincent Negri, for this work that we've been doing over so many years together. Thank you.
Merci.
We've just got we're on the final lap. Thank you.
Donc, comme vous pouvez le voir à l'écran,
as you can see here on screen, we will be resuming at 2 p.m. The speakers are kindly invited to have lunch with us, where we had coffee this morning.
Et pour les autres participants,
The other
vous pouvez vous égayer dans les jardins du quai Branly ou dans les petits bistrots des alentours.
Are free to have lunch in the area. Thank you.